Hey everyone, welcome to a book talk. This is going to cover the titles I read for the first half of this year. I'm a little late, but I've been busy and I have the time now, so I figured I would get on with it. Going to be a little tricky. A number of these were digital, but I have my Kindle here and I hope to be able to flash the covers up of the title so you can see what I'm talking about. I have a few physical, so I'll talk about those first, and I will talk about the only fiction book I read first, and that was Isaac Asimov's The Complete Stories. This is the first volume. There are two. This goes chronologically, so at the bottom of each story, you'll see the publisher and the date the story was published. So at the bottom, this says 1956 by King Size Publications. The earliest is 1956. Yeah, The Dead Past. This is probably going to be the book you want to get if you're interested in his short stories, because it includes his two most popular that I know of, which is Nightfall, which won several awards for best science fiction story ever. He won that a few times, and of course that updates. The other is The Last Question. That's a very famous one as well. And there's one I really like called The Sea Shoot, which has one of the best descriptions of someone walking in outer space or on a space hull. That one was really fun. A lot of times the endings aren't going to wow you like you kind of expect these days, but that's because the stories are that old. Well, it opens up with a scene, and it's pretty novel the way he did it, of a paragraph about what one character is doing, then a paragraph about what they're all doing, and then the next paragraph will refer to the second paragraph, but then expound on one of the characters involved in a conversation or incident. And he unfolds the story that way, so you get the bigger picture. The Last Question is pretty interesting because it includes one of the few or only bits of continuity he has throughout many of his stories, the device called the multivac, which is a super powerful computer. Now, when you read the stories, some of them he wrote at a later date or set in earlier times, and it details the history of multivac and how it was designed to solve humanity's problems, and you get to see how it evolves throughout centuries. Well, more than centuries. The Last Question is set far, far, millennia in the future. So if you read all the stories, you get this wonderful sense of how this one little device started off as, maybe trying to solve traffic and hunger and food production, and it just gets evolved into this thing that basically runs humanity. The only negatives to the story are, since they are from the 50s, some are pretty dated in terms of, and it's not his fault. He was so influential, like Ray Bradbury or Rod Serling, that many people, the writers, copied what they've done. So you'll read stories that sound very familiar, and that's because you've probably seen an episode of The Outer Limits or a science fiction movie that basically took that premise he had and ran with it. So it's kind of, you'll feel like you're retreading ground. Another is you really get a sense of how things have changed. I mentioned this when I first picked the book up, on a pickup video, but yeah, like men will throttle women and choke them and push them, and a guy will just smack a woman and she'll apologize. And think about if you did that to your significant other today, what would happen? Far different. I'm pretty sure my wife would just destroy me with the nearest implement she could find. So those, not only is that odd, but it really does detract from some of the stories. One in particular, like she's I think a female scientist, and she's very pivotal to the story. And her husband, I think, chokes her or something, slams her against the wall, and she becomes very demure after that. And yeah, that's what you would expect in a story of the age, but it really kind of throws off the pacing of the story to a modern reader. So, and another is a focus on religion. Now, you see this in the Twilight Zones and Outer Limits. It's some of the stories, a handful. Don't be put off if you don't find it interesting. I don't really find them interesting. Kind of like in the Twilight Zones, The Howling Man. That's some people's, that is ranked as a favorite episode among some people. And I like the atmosphere of it, but I find the story itself not that interesting. And that's kind of how it is in here. Like there's, the devil appears a few times, like he's a Lord of the Flies, and I just don't find that compelling. I'm sure in 1956 it was way more compelling. I mean, since then we've had just the film The Exorcist goes so far beyond what any of these stories will ever do that when you read them, they're just kind of quaint and they don't really have an impact. I'm sure at the time, like I said, pretty big impact. Reading them now, it's like, okay, it's a very traditional view of the devil. All right, but now in 2018, we've seen this thousands and thousands of times throughout every movie you can think of. Like Blumhouse probably makes a movie about this every 2 weeks. But it is definitely worth getting for the last question, the Sea Shoot. What was the other one? Nightfall, which is really good. It's very, I don't want to say forward thinking, but it's very different from what was written at the time. It's about a civilization that is worried about when these stars are going to appear because there's this cyclic destruction that in their stories that happens every 1,000 years or so, that when the stars appear, everything burns on the planet, and it's getting to that point, and the tension builds up, and then when it finally happens, it is a really good twist. You're not expecting it, and you're like, oh man, that was if all of them were like that, this would be amazing. But few people have that story in them, and he's got a handful that are that good. So yeah, that volume is definitely worth it. I'm getting volume 2 when I can. This was only $17 on Amazon. It's definitely affordable. It does not have a Kindle version, and neither does volume 2. But definitely, you're looking at, let me see if I can see the stories. It's got a brief introduction by him, and it's actually pretty funny. He sneaks in a lot of jokes. It's 613 pages. Now, keep in mind, a few of these are just poems or limericks. Some of them are him poking fun at the genre itself. Some are him poking fun at other authors, just in good fun. Yeah, some aren't, I would consider classics, but very much worth reading. There was one about teleporters that was pretty good. I can't find it. Oh, well, here's one. I'm in Marsport Without Hilda. That's more of a jokey one. So you'll get a little bit of everything in this. But yeah, definitely worth picking up. So that's the only fiction book I read. So if that's all you're interested in, thanks for watching. I did yammer on for almost 8 minutes about it. Now let's move on to nonfiction. What I'm currently reading, which I won't talk about, except just to say like this is what is loaded up, is Aetius, Attila's Enemy by Ian Hughes. Now, he has one of the very few books in English on Belisarius. That's where I first heard about him. He did another book on Stilicho, which I thought was a bit too apologetic on Stilicho's behalf. And this is on Aetius, who came after Stilicho, but very much in the same tradition. Think of him as the power behind the throne. Won't get into any more detail on that. It's not a very long book. It is a pen and sword published book. So those are always about 200 to 300 pages. There are a few that are longer, but they're general reader material, so you can get through them very quickly. So I'll be done with that one shortly. Now, what I did read is, let me find it here. Okay. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm going to say Lysimachus, a study in early Hellenistic kingship. Now, he was a successor to Alexander the Great, and by all accounts, he knew Alexander better than any of the other successors. He served alongside him as, I want to say, a bodyguard, a hypaspis. His kingdom was, excuse me, his kingdom was along the Hellespont. So it ended up straddling it at some points. Other points it constricted. He had a pretty poor hand. Whenever the satrapies were being doled out after Alexander's death, Seleucus got Babylon. Perdiccas got the, what was it? He looked over Alexander's children. Ptolemy was in Egypt. Antigonus got really prime pieces of the Near East. Craterus was he took over Macedonia. Well, Lysimachus basically got, Eumenes is the only person that got the shorter end of the straw. Lysimachus got basically a land overran by Thracian warriors. He had to clear them out. He founded a lot of cities, and he actually was able to survive for quite a while. He teamed up with Seleucus and Ptolemy a few times. This little back here says it foreshadowed the kingdom of Pergamum and Byzantium. So to give you an idea of the area in which he ruled. Let's see if there's a good map. This is the only book I know of on him, and this is the author Helen Lund, the only book I can find that she's written. I really wish she wrote more, because this is an excellent study. I'm not sure if this will be picked up, but this is the Black Sea, the Propontis, Byzantium's here, and Thrace is here, Hellespontine, Phrygia. So he ruled kind of this area here. He gradually extended it to, like I said, across the Hellespont. He helped out Cassander in Macedon and Greece quite a bit. He helped out fighting the Antigonids, but unfortunately he ended up losing his life and his empire fell apart. But what this book goes over is not just him. Sorry about that. It goes over Hellenistic kingship, and that involves a little of everything. The importance of coins in extolling the virtues of the ruler. That was probably the quickest, easiest, and best way to spread propaganda, is he would use symbolism to tie himself closer to Alexander than the others, and by all accounts, like I said, he was. Ptolemy did serve in a middle to high command in the army, but it said that Lysimachus actually saved Alexander's life during a hunt, and he makes a big to-do of that. It talked about the importance of statues in a town. If a town or a polis put up a statue of a king, this happened quite a bit with the Antigonids, it was basically giving up a bit of their independence. It was calling that person their protector and letting them call some of the shots. Lysimachus often had a kind of a hands-off approach. He would let area rule itself as long as they pay taxes. He would send judges in to handle disputes. So it talks about how important the statue was, which I've never read in another book. What all it represents. Everything was important on the statue. The base of the statue was important. What was it made out of? How much was written on it? Was it embellished? Then the statue itself, what was it made out of? What was it? What kind of ornaments did it have? Were those gold, silver? Did it have weapons? How was it posed? What that position represented? And all of that meant something to the people, to the person who created it, to the town that hosted it, and to the person that received it as a gift. So after Ipsus, the empire extended. Governor of the Greeks, some more. Kingship cult in the court. So that's where I was talking about the statues. It also talks about where his income came from, how he taxed, how he governed in the areas where he taxed. Scheming women and senile decay. That's just people try to blame his wife for his downfall and that he kind of lost it towards the end. But he did live quite a while, and it sounds more of just like someone being ran down through years of fighting. But only book on him I know of, and it happens to be fantastic. So if you're interested in the period, the Diadochi, or the successor period, or Lysimachus, or the region, or just early Hellenistic kingship, definitely give this a read. Keeping with the Greek theme is Greek religion and society. Now, I've been reading about this because I'm curious when I read about Greeks talk about God. Now, a lot of times they don't say gods, they say God singular. So I'm wondering, who are they talking about? And it's very hard to find that answer. And that's because when you come from, a position of today, you think of paganism as paganism. When in reality, paganism is like when you say Germans in antiquity or American Indian. That's just a grouping. Each thing is populated by hundreds of thousands of different tribes or beliefs. So when we say paganism, it's just not one belief system that believes in many gods. Each god had its own belief system, essentially. So the best I can suss out is they had similar to a Gnostic viewpoint in that everything emanated from one perfect source. And the further you get out from that source, the greater the imperfection. Zeus sometimes represents that perfect source. Other times he's the closest object to the source. This book didn't go too much into detail on that. It's really more about, in many ways, the mechanics of Greek religion. So, views about life after death. I very rarely read about ancient Greek views on life after death. So that was really interesting. Kind of less interesting, but I can see why they did it, is temple design. Um, they talk about the importance of why a certain altar was positioned in a certain place. A little more interesting is art and the symbolism, what the pieces represent. We don't have much symbolism in art today. It's very straightforward. We're back then, when you're trying to say a lot with very little. A sculptor or an engraving is expensive, so you try to cram a lot of information into, like, say, one panel. So it might look like three people, but one represents the sun, one represents the moon. Together they represent the seasons, and a third entity might represent the person's career or something. There's a lot of personification of things going on, of positions, of elements, of nature. But it will help you expand your view. They do not talk about individual gods and goddesses, so it's not like there's a really famous book on mythology by a female author. Oh, where is it? I have it over there. It's you've probably read it. It's, I think, the go-to book you read in high school and college, where she goes through dozens of major and minor deities. This does not do that. This also talks about, so here's a temple design here. It also talks about the sophists and their persecution when they questioned some of the religious practices of the day. They were thrown out to the sea. They were exiled. They were just straight up killed. How they tried to raise education to a level that just simply didn't rely on rituals and traditional views of gods. How they wanted to kind of expand the knowledge of nature. That's the back end of the book. So for me, probably the best is the views about death, because, like I said, you really don't hear about it, and the gist of it is that it's really hard to determine. They just didn't talk about it a lot. Some viewed that there was something, some viewed that there wasn't. It wasn't very systematic, and I think that's what it's hard to come to from a modern perspective. Is the major religions now are very systematic, and it doesn't take you long to learn their views on anything. Well, like I said, when you're talking about paganism, you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of variations of belief systems. Someone actually highlighted in the book, this wasn't me, this was about Greek temples, why and where. What'd they highlight? Cults practiced far away from any city in a wild mountainous setting. Cults connected with the great pan-Hellenic sanctuaries independent of any polis. Character of the architecture was to some extent dictated by the needs of the cult. Temples which served the official cults would be small rooms within a ruler's palace. Oh, that's an interesting thing, because this segues from how religion went from being basically predominant in the aristocracy to expanding out to everyone. So the ruler would have a temple in his palace, and then rooms aside within their homes for private worship. And then gradually, as the first Dark Ages came and the fall of the island kingdoms, what was that? Crete, whatever, Manoa. That's when you have temples and towns emerging. So that was really interesting. So moving on from there, we have, these are going to be digital books. So let me try to fire up the Kindle here and show you. Now, one of these, how can I do this? It's a very, very expensive book, and I didn't buy it. Instead, some angel on archive.org, they scanned it and put it up because it is like a $300 to $400 book. So let me see if I can find it here. I should be able to. It is John Granger, who writes a lot about the Seleucid kingdoms. He recently put out 3 or 4 books for Pen and Sword Books. I've talked about those before. Well, he's done a lot of the predominant Seleucid historian. Where is it at here? And he has a series of books from the early 90s that are very, very hard to get a hold of today. Here we go. And so this one is called The Syrian Wars. You can go download it from archive.org. I highly recommend it. And it details the fight between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Initially, Ptolemy backed Seleucus in his bid to retake Babylonia. And then what happens is, during a fight with Antigonus, Ptolemy only goes up to a port along the Levant, and then he stops. So he didn't. Ooh, my cat's in here trying to drink my water. Um, he didn't take place in the actual fighting. So when it came time to split the spoils, he didn't get much, and he was very upset. Where Seleucus got a nice prime chunk of move out the way property, and that kicked off what 2 to 3 centuries of warfare. And what ended up happening is when people read about Rome taking the Hellenic kingdoms, what resulted was basically what Byzantium or the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanids did is they wore each other down until the Arabs or the Muslim Arabic invasion was able to take both of them over. Same thing happened here. The Ptolemies and Seleucids basically wore themselves out in conjunction with internal fighting, which both of them stoked on each other's side. The Seleucid family tree is massive because there are so many usurpers, and many of those were backed by the Ptolemies. The problem with the Ptolemaic dynasty is it had the money, but it needed to subjugate the population anytime it tried to have a large war. It did engage in a few of them. They risked a revolt at home, whereas the Seleucids actually had, for its size, a fairly stable population, but they were always short on money because they were constantly fighting people trying to, she keeps walking around me, trying to take over the kingdom. So at one point you had 3 or 4 rulers, and this, as the Seleucid kingdom shrinks, at this point it's not quite a rump state, but there's like 3 or 4 rulers in just one small area. So they basically wore themselves out, and it's a very good treatise on how the conflict started, how they both approached governance. The Seleucids built really strong fortified cities along the royal road, and the Ptolemies would build fortified cities in difficult to reach locations. So anytime either one of them tried to attack each other, they had a very rough go at it. Very rarely did they settle their differences, and the few times they would settle their differences, a lot of times it was a Ptolemaic king who would screw things up, because they each had 3 or 4 really good rulers, and then the rest, some mediocre and a handful of just very bad ones. The Ptolemies especially, strange things would happen with the Seleucids. They had someone that just appeared one day and said he was a son of, I think, Antiochus II or Seleucus II, and somehow gathered a very large following with money from the Attalids in Pergamum and Ptolemy, and waged a war in the northern part of the kingdom for years. So you get all that, way more detail. Just excellent book, especially that you can get it for free. So you can get it as a PDF or a Kindle format, and a few others. The Kindle format, though, had some odd characters in it, so definitely get the PDF one. Let's see, 23 minutes. Let me wrap this up. I read 2 more books in this period, so let me find them. One is a pen and sword book I got at a very good price because they disappoint me enough to where I don't want to put decent money down on their titles, but when they sell them for $1 to $3, I will go ahead and pick one up. Where is it? It's on the Roman Emperor Maximinius Thrax. Here it is. That's the cover. Now, what's interesting about him is that very recently, I think in 2008, there was a battle site discovered within Germany, and it was hundreds of miles within the modern German border, and they didn't know what to think of it because they believed at the time that he was around, which is let's see, I'm trying to get an exact date of his reign here, 245? Let's see. No, when was it? Shoot. I'm not seeing it. It is in the 3rd century. But essentially what happened was they believed that the furthest a punitive expedition would go within Germany was maybe 10, 20 miles. Well, they found this battle site, and it turned out to have hundreds of arrowheads and bolt heads. And it was hundreds of miles in Germany, and they believe it was Maximinius Thrax returning from a punitive expedition. Some Germanic tribes attempted to ambush him, and instead they got the better of the tribe. So it kind of pushes back what they thought the Romans were capable of at this time, because we have this idea of them, the military disintegrating and it being very inept, when in actuality, the Western Empire, despite the fact that it continually lost land, was very effective for a really long time. People talk about the barbarization of the army. Well, a lot of that gets down to manpower shortage. I'm reading a great book on manpower now I'll talk about later. But so yeah, this pushes back the view of what the Romans were capable of. And so if they were able to go hundreds of miles into Germany, destroy everything along their path and fight their way out, they were still extremely formidable for much longer than people suspected or expect. And this book, it's okay. It's the only one on him I know of. It tries to cut out a lot of the ridiculous hyperbole you get in later sources. Unfortunately, he gets bogged down in a campaign in Italy against the usurper, and his soldiers end up killing him. But for a brief stint, he is pretty successful. There's a story of how he became an emperor. He was this hulking guy that caught the eye of, I believe, Septimius Severus. And he immediately got enrolled in the army and got a decent position, and he worked his way up quite rapidly. He guarded one of the border areas in the Middle East, and then made his way to Europe, and he himself usurped the throne. Quick read, like I said, typical pen and sword books, got some typos, got some problems, but it's the only book on them, and pretty interesting because you just don't hear a lot about him. That's because there isn't a lot about him, so the author tries to squeeze as much as possible whenever possible. And the final book, and this one's really interesting for kind of breaking the mold on things, and that is Early Roman Warfare. Now, for a very long time, it was assumed that the Romans had a very linear progression path in their military, in that they went from fighting as tribes to fighting the hoplite, and then from there on formed what we know as the legions. But this does a very good job of disproving that. It's from the regal period to the First Punic War, showing that they fought much more like a Homeric style, which is one-on-one, for far longer than is said. The archaeological evidence for quite often supports this view, that what you had in Rome were essentially warlords, which happens later in the empire. Rome, as it expands, becomes a magnet for these local rich, like aristocrats, but they become warlords because they attract bands of followers, they arm them. But this isn't like state-issued equipment. This is one-on-one. This is whatever they can bring. And the bigger Rome becomes, the more it draws these people in. And Rome essentially forms contracts with these people to protect it. The Senate and the people give them some power. In exchange for that power, they protect Rome. And then they start competing with one another. And it's only as it expands further and further, and these people get more ingrained in the society of Rome, and more of a move into it and closer to it and off their vast estates, which they'll still keep, but they spend more time in Rome. That's when they settle down. That's when the political system really starts to solidify. And they had the client-patron system, so a lot of people owed them service. So a number of men could raise large armies fairly quickly. And some of the competing cities did that against Rome, but Rome attracted more of them. And as they attracted more of them, they competed with one another, and that competition really grew into what we now would think of as a traditional First Punic Roman army. So it did a really good job of kind of dispelling some myths. You don't see it talked about a lot, mainly because it's just easier to go from, okay, well, they fought as individual units, and then they obviously adopted the Greek hoplite style, and then they were reformed. But this is saying, no, they were actually much looser, less disciplined, less tied to the state, and just less rigid overall, not nearly the hierarchy people expect, for much, much longer. So very much worth your time. It's 30 minutes. Thank you for watching this, and I will talk to everyone later.